My name is Julia Harper. I was 29 years old when my sister mocked me for not having a job right there in our mother's living room in front of all her friends like it was harmless entertainment. It was one of those family gatherings that pretends to be casual while quietly turning into a performance. And my sister was in the center of it, talking loudly about work deadlines, office drama, and how exhausted she always seemed, holding everyone's attention without trying. Her friends leaned in, laughed on cue, nodded along like everything she said carried weight. I was sitting off to the side, half out of the circle, mostly unnoticed until someone finally glanced at me and asked what I'd been doing lately. Before I could open my mouth, my sister answered for me. She smiled, shrugged, and said it in a tone that sounded playful enough to pass, but sharp enough to land no steady job still figuring things out, said loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. A couple of people laughed, not uncomfortably, not even cruelly, just casually, like it was the most natural joke in the world. Then she looked at me and asked if I could grab more drinks, maybe clear a few plates while I was up. It wasn't framed as an order, and that was the point. No one questioned it. No one noticed anything wrong. So I stood up, carried empty glasses into the kitchen, and did exactly that, listening from the other room as they kept talking about their teams, their meetings, the company they all worked for, speaking with confidence about a place they believed they understood. They thought I had no direction, no leverage, no authority in that space. And what they didn't know, not one of them, was that every single person in that room worked for a company I owned. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain anything that night. I just paid attention because moments like that don't disappear. They come back later, usually when people least expect it. Before I tell you how that night set everything in motion, take a second to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because stories like this tend to travel further than anyone in that room ever imagined. That night didn't feel new. The dynamic had been forming since we were kids, long before job titles or careers entered the picture. Amanda and I grew up in the same house in Wyoming, shared the same routines, the same schools, the same holidays. Yet from early on, it was clear that we moved through our family very differently. Amanda had an ease with people that adults responded to immediately. She spoke without hesitation, filled silences without effort, and seemed naturally comfortable being watched. Teachers remembered her, neighbors asked about her plans. Relatives leaned in when she talked. I learned quickly that visibility came easily to her, while I existed somewhere just outside the center of attention. I did well in school quietly and consistently, finished assignments early, followed instructions, and avoided mistakes. But accomplishment without performance rarely holds a room. When report cards came home, my grades were briefly acknowledged, often paired with a comment about how responsible or independent I was, as if that explained why there was nothing more to say. Amanda's experiences, even minor ones, turned into conversations, into family discussions, into collective concern or celebration. My mother never meant to create a hierarchy. She wasn't dismissive or harsh, but she developed habits without realizing what they reinforced. She asked Amanda questions, first checked in with her, more often explained her choices when Amanda pushed back, while trusting me to figure things out on my own. Over time, that trust stopped feeling like confidence and started feeling like absence. I learned that if I needed help, asking might not change much, and if I had good news, sharing it wouldn't shift the energy in the room. So I adjusted. I stopped volunteering information unless someone asked directly. I stopped correcting assumptions when people misunderstood my interests or my plans. At family gatherings, I sat slightly apart, listened more than I spoke, and stepped in quietly when something needed to be done, clearing spaces, filling gaps, becoming useful without being visible. No one instructed me to do this, and no one noticed when it became automatic. It simply fit the role that had been carved out for me over years of small moments that never seemed serious enough to address. Amanda grew up knowing how to take up space, how to expect response. while I grew up learning that silence was efficient and self-reliance was safer than expectation. There wasn't resentment at first because nothing about it felt dramatic or unfair on the surface. It was subtle enough to pass as normal, reinforced by repetition rather than choice. By the time I understood what was happening, it had already shaped how I saw myself in relation to other people. I trusted my abilities, but I didn't expect recognition. I valued outcomes more than validation because validation at home had never been consistent. That pattern didn't push me away from my family, but it did teach me to build inner distance, a way of moving through rooms without needing approval from the people inside them. Long before I ever started a company or made decisions that carried weight, I had learned how to exist without being centered, and that lesson stayed with me far beyond childhood. After college, I stopped waiting for approval. I didn't announce that decision or argue about it. I simply started building a life that didn't require anyone's permission to move forward. Technology made sense to me because systems behaved predictably when people often didn't. I learned how work broke down inside organizations, how small inefficiencies turned into lost time, and how businesses relied on tools that no longer fit the way they actually operated. While most people I knew looked outward, chasing bigger cities and louder opportunities, I kept noticing how Laramie functioned day to day and where it quietly struggled. Local businesses worked hard, hired responsibly, and stayed loyal to their communities, but they tracked projects across emails, spreadsheets, and handwritten notes that slowed everything down without anyone saying it out loud. There was no dramatic failure, just constant friction, and that friction created an opening. I didn't think in terms of disruption or growth. At first, I thought in terms of usefulness. I began designing a simple software platform that helped teams organize tasks, communicate internally, and see progress without layers of complexity. It wasn't built to impress, it was built to be relied on. From the start, I made a conscious decision to keep my name out of anything public. I registered the company through structures that protected ownership privacy and appointed representatives who dealt with clients and filings instead of me. That choice wasn't about hiding, it was about control. I had no interest in watching family dynamics, social expectations, or personal history bleed into something I was trying to build on merit alone. Quiet ownership allowed the work to stand independently without commentary or assumptions attached to it. I worked long hours out of modest spaces, tested features directly with early users, fixed problems as they appeared, and repeated that process until the product became stable enough to support real operations. Progress came slowly but consistently, driven by renewals rather than pitch decks, and over time that consistency turned into trust. The first person I brought fully into that structure was Colleen. We were connected through professional channels, and she stood out immediately by focusing on operations instead of titles. She asked how decisions were made, how authority flowed, and how accountability was assigned, questions that mattered more than how fast the company could grow. I told her from the beginning that ownership needed to remain private, and that her role required protecting that boundary. She accepted without hesitation, not because she didn't care who was in charge, but because she understood that stability matters more than visibility. As Chief Operating Officer, Colleen handled internal systems, hiring processes, and day-to-day execution, while I remained focused on long-term direction and product integrity. Inside the company, I was known as someone involved in strategy, but not positioned above everyone else in daily interactions. Most employees never spoke to me directly, and that distance created a culture where work was evaluated on output and consistency rather than proximity to power. The company didn't expand quickly, and that was intentional. Each contract was earned, each hire measured, and each adjustment made with caution rather than urgency. From the outside, there was nothing dramatic to point to, no sudden rise or public recognition, but internally the structure held. Systems worked. Expectations were clear. Problems were addressed without noise. For the first time, I was operating inside a framework where progress didn't depend on being noticed, only on being effective. I didn't bring that part of my life home, and I didn't correct the assumptions people made about me because separation had become a form of stability, and for a while that stability felt sufficient. That was when my mother called. She spoke the way she always did when talking about Amanda, careful not to ask directly, but letting concern do the work for her, saying Amanda needed stability, something long-term, something that could finally stick. I didn't react right away. I understood what accepting would mean, not just operationally, but emotionally, because family and structure rarely mix cleanly. Still, I agreed under clear conditions. Amanda would apply like everyone else, interview through the standard process, and enter at a role that matched her experience without exceptions written quietly behind the scenes. Inside the company, the request was treated as a referral and nothing more. Amanda was hired into the sales team under Ethan Wallace, a manager who valued confidence and momentum, someone who believed energy solved more problems than caution ever could. In the beginning, nothing felt off. Amanda learned the product quickly, spoke comfortably on client calls, and blended into the team without drawing unnecessary attention. She didn't demand authority or challenge structure outright. Instead, she adapted, and adaptation turned out to be more effective. She gravitated toward a small group almost immediately, pulling one close friend into that circle through an informal recommendation, and over time, that cluster became consistent, predictable, and difficult to miss. In meetings, they answered for one another, redirected conversations smoothly, and filled silences before others had the chance to step in. During smaller discussions, it became clear who set the tone and who followed it, even though titles never changed. Humor became a shortcut for influence, delivered lightly but aimed with intention, jokes, framed as harmless observations that seemed to land better when directed away from the group itself. People outside that circle were never confronted directly, just edged out of momentum, interrupted more often, or spoken over with a smile that made objection feel awkward. None of it violated policy. No single moment stood out enough to document. Performance numbers stayed strong. Client metrics held steady. And by every formal measure, the team was functioning. Ethan didn't interfere, not because he was indifferent, but because nothing presented as a problem he could act on. From a management perspective, there were no clear signals to escalate. What formed instead was an informal structure, one that didn't rely on authority, but on alignment, where decisions felt settled before consensus was reached. Newer employees adjusted quietly, learning when it was better to wait than to contribute. Others stopped offering ideas unless prompted directly. The absence of complaints didn't reflect comfort, it reflected uncertainty. Because describing what was happening would have required clarity, no one felt confident claiming. Influence moved laterally instead of hierarchically, gathering around personality rather than role, and that made it harder to challenge. I observed without intervening, tracking patterns across meetings and feedback summaries, noticing how behavior replicated itself without needing instruction. Amanda never asserted control openly. She didn't need to. The system allowed space for it, and that space widened incrementally. From the outside, it could be mistaken for chemistry or initiative. From inside the structure, it felt like balance shifting without acknowledgement. I didn't correct it yet. Systems expose their faults more clearly when they're allowed to operate uninterrupted, and at that stage, understanding how influence flowed mattered more than stepping in prematurely. The company continued delivering, revenue remained stable, and operations moved forward as expected, while beneath that surface an unspoken hierarchy had taken shape, one that relied less on authority and more on who controlled the room when no one else was watching. The first person to say something had already left. Paula Ortiz reached out after her resignation had been processed and forgotten, her departure coded as routine and uneventful, the kind of exit companies archive without discussion. She did not ask for help, and she did not accuse anyone. She only asked whether we could talk without records, without notes, without anything that could follow her name later. When we spoke, her tone stayed controlled, almost careful, as if she had already rehearsed which details were safe to share and which ones were better left unsaid. She explained that the change inside the company had not arrived with conflict, but with adjustment, small shifts that felt harmless at first and then became difficult to escape. Meetings, she said, used to move slowly. Ideas passed around until something solid formed. Over time, those conversations shortened. Decisions seemed to land before discussion fully started. Certain people spoke early, and often others learned to wait, and then stopped waiting at all. Paula noticed that disagreement didn't get challenged directly, it simply lost momentum. Someone would start to speak, catch the tone of the room, and choose not to finish the thought. Silence replaced friction because silence required less explanation. She said humor played an important role, always light, always framed as bonding, but frequently aimed in ways that signaled who belonged inside the rhythm and who existed just outside it. No insult was explicit enough to document. No moment stood still long enough to be quoted. When someone reacted poorly, the conversation moved on quickly, leaving no clear point of reference. Paula admitted she thought about filing a complaint more than once, but the system itself discouraged it. There was nothing singular to report, no precise language that could survive review without sounding subjective, and no assurance that raising concerns wouldn't redefine her reputation permanently. Being labeled sensitive, difficult, or not aligned felt like a greater risk than adapting quietly. She said leaving felt like the only option that didn't require her to reshape herself to fit an environment she no longer recognized. After that conversation, I didn't treat what she said as proof of intent or misconduct, but I stopped interpreting our lack of formal complaints as a sign of stability. I began reviewing HR notes more carefully, reading what had been written cautiously instead of what had been stated clearly. Phrases appeared repeatedly with slight variations, words like tension, communication gaps, energy shifts. Always vague, always non-confrontational. I looked at internal chat logs not for explicit messages, but for flow, who initiated threads, whose contributions drew responses, and which conversations faded without resolution. Meeting summaries revealed patterns that numbers alone would have missed: the same voices shaping decisions, the same accelerations happening before broader input formed. Participation narrowed over time, not because policies changed, but because people learned which moments mattered and which didn't. Individually, these elements would have meant nothing. Together, they formed a structure that rewarded alignment and quietly discouraged deviation. Nothing in the company punished dissent openly, but nothing protected it either. Influence passed through familiarity, timing, and proximity, not titles. Paula hadn't left because of one uncomfortable encounter. She left because staying would have required continued silence, and silence had a cost she was no longer willing to pay. Her departure didn't accuse anyone, but it confirmed what the data had already begun to suggest. The system was producing predictable outcomes while appearing neutral, and predictability is often the clearest signal that something deeper is shaping behavior. By the time someone sets boundaries through absence, the environment has already taught everyone else how to remain quiet without being asked. I needed to see it myself. I applied under a different name, one chosen precisely because it meant nothing paired with a resume stripped of authority, ambition, or anything that might invite special treatment. I wanted to move through the process exactly the way everyone else did, without signals, without leverage, without recognition. The interview invite came quickly and quietly scheduled, with a small panel that included my sister and two people whose names I already associated with narrowed conversations and accelerated decisions. I signed in using the assumed name, once introduced myself briefly, then let the room take control. From the start, the interview didn't feel investigative. Questions overlapped and faded before answers settled. Interruptions weren't confrontational, they were habitual, delivered with the ease of people who never expected resistance. Whenever I spoke for more than a sentence, attention drifted. Someone glanced away. Someone else smiled too early, as if anticipating where my words would land, without needing to hear them. Laughter appeared in short bursts, never loud enough to call out, but frequent enough to signal that the purpose of the conversation had already shifted. I wasn't being evaluated for fit. I was being experienced. Amanda leaned comfortably into the exchange, her posture relaxed, her comments framed as helpful, but timed in ways that redirected momentum. She paraphrased my responses before I could finish them, smoothing over qualifiers, flattening nuance into something easier to dismiss. Her tone was familiar, lightly authoritative, the same tone she used whenever certainty mattered more than context. I watched how the others responded to her cues, how their reactions aligned before she finished speaking, how rhythm mattered more than substance. At one point, someone joked about candidates who slow teams down by asking too many questions. It was said with a smile and no target attached, but the implication didn't need direction. When I asked how dissent was handled in decision-making, the answer arrived before space could form around it. Amanda cut in easily, explaining that the team valued efficiency and trusted internal alignment, suggesting that too much discussion often created unnecessary friction. The phrasing was polished, but the message was clear. There was a right way to participate, and a quieter way to disappear. Throughout the interview, nothing crossed a line sharp enough to document. Everything lived in implication, timing, and tone. That was the point. The process was intact on paper. The behavior was protected by informality. When the interview ended, there were no next steps mentioned, no closing remarks to anchor the exchange. I thanked them and logged out, leaving behind a version of myself that would be quickly replaced and easily forgotten. Sitting alone afterward, I didn't replay the details or catalog remarks. What stayed with me wasn't what was said, but how effortlessly the dynamic held together without instruction. That room functioned on shared permission, reinforced quietly through familiarity. In my family, that dynamic had always existed, uneven, but contained something I learned to navigate rather than challenge. Inside the company I built, it contradicted every structure I put in place to prevent power from concentrating where it wasn't examined. For the first time, those two worlds overlapped without separation. On one side was family loyalty, unspoken, but persistent, asking to be preserved the way it always had been, by absorbing discomfort rather than exposing it. On the other side was the framework I designed, one that only worked if it remained indifferent to relationship and proximity. I didn't resolve the tension in that moment or frame it as a choice. I simply acknowledged that neutrality was no longer possible. The interview hadn't revealed new information. It confirmed alignment where alignment shouldn't have existed. I closed my laptop and returned to my day, knowing that recognition had already altered the situation, and once something is seen clearly, pretending otherwise becomes a decision of its own. What came next wasn't emotional, it was procedural. I met with Colleen Marsh early that morning with one goal: to address structure before addressing people. We didn't begin with opinions, family relationships, or assumptions about intent. We began with documentation laid out in sequence: hiring data, interview participation records, internal notes, performance reviews, team response patterns, and time-based comparisons that showed how behavior shifted once certain informal dynamics became stable. The material didn't accuse anyone. It simply demonstrated consistency, and consistency, when examined across layers, reveals responsibility. Colleen approached it the way she always did, by tracing where authority was assigned versus where it was exercised. When we aligned behavioral signals with reporting lines, the gap became visible immediately. Oversight existed on paper but not in practice. Decisions moved faster than review cycles. Participation narrowed without intervention. Discomfort appeared in notes without escalation. That pointed directly to Simon Reed, the senior manager responsible for the sales division's operational supervision. Simon had no complaints attached to his name and no record of overt violations, which is often how oversight failures persist longest. The review focused on what he allowed rather than what he initiated. Repeated indicators had passed through his scope without action. Informal power clusters were left unexamined, and team conduct evolved without correction. Leadership isn't tested in moments of conflict alone. It's tested in what quietly becomes routine. Simon's contract was terminated the same day, effective immediately categorized strictly as a failure of managerial oversight. No speeches were made, no motives were debated. The decision followed policy and precedent, and it ended there. Once that position was removed, the evaluation moved downward through the structure with precision. A secondary review identified several individuals in Amanda's orbit whose behavior consistently reinforced exclusionary patterns. Some were placed on formal improvement plans tied to clearly defined participation and conduct standards, with monitoring mechanisms attached. Others were exited based on cumulative documentation that already existed but had never been interpreted as connected. Each action fit within existing procedure applied evenly, without commentary or exception. No one was singled out publicly. No explanations were offered beyond what policy required. The effect was immediate. Meetings slowed just enough to allow interruption to be noticed. Participation rebalanced. Certain voices became less dominant without support from unchecked alignment. All of it occurred without drama, which is how systemic correction should feel. Throughout the process, Amanda had no indication that any of these changes related to her. There was no reason for her to think otherwise. Her role hadn't been named in those meetings because it wasn't time. Structural correction comes first because naming individuals before stabilizing systems only creates defensiveness and evasion. When process is restored, behavior has nowhere to hide. By the end of the day, reporting thresholds had been clarified, oversight responsibilities reinforced, and review protocols reset, with explicit triggers attached. Colleen and I didn't frame the work in moral terms. We framed it in sequence. You correct what allowed the behavior to concentrate. You close the pathways that protected familiarity from challenge. Only then do you examine the individuals who benefited from those conditions. Addressing people before systems teaches the organization the wrong lesson. It suggests that accountability is personal rather than structural. Amanda still believed she was operating inside an environment that favored her cadence and tone. She hadn't felt the shift yet, but the environment had already changed around her. The framework no longer flexed to accommodate informal authority. Whatever followed would not happen privately or emotionally, or with allowances made for history. It would move through the same channels every other adjustment had moved through that day, documented, aligned with policy, indifferent to relationship. By the time systems are corrected properly, outcomes stop appearing punitive. They appear unavoidable. I asked Amanda to come in the next morning. She arrived calm, almost casual, carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who believed she was walking into a conversation shaped by family concern rather than professional consequence. She spoke first, referencing our mother, asking if something had happened, treating the meeting as if it existed outside the structure of the company. I let her speak without redirecting her assumptions, then told her clearly that this meeting was not about family and never had been. When I informed her that I owned the company, I did it without pause or emphasis, not as a reveal, but as a fact that no longer needed protection. The realization didn't arrive as disbelief. It arrived as recalibration. Her posture adjusted, her expressions caught up with memories she'd already lived through without knowing how they would matter later. I placed the documentation in front of her, not selectively, not strategically, but completely: interview records, written summaries, timeline patterns, behavior reviews, accumulated over months, correlated across teams and oversight gaps. I didn't explain them because explanation suggested deliberation, and deliberation had already occurred. When she tried to respond, I stopped the exchange and told her the decision predated this meeting. Her role in the company was terminated effective immediately for sustained conduct issues that violated participation and professionalism standards. The language was precise, procedural, and identical to the language used for every other separation that week. She asked if there was room for reconsideration if separating personal history from professional outcome was possible, if this moment could be handled privately. I told her that privacy had already been accounted for and that separation was exactly what had failed. I explained that references would remain neutral, limited to role confirmation and duration of employment, without endorsement or informal advocacy. In a professional environment, the size of Laramie's silence carries as much weight as explanation, and absence of reference becomes a message people know how to interpret. The consequences unfolded without intervention. Calls weren't returned. Opportunities narrowed. Networks that once felt accessible closed quietly, not through discussion but through hesitation. The company didn't speak about her, and that restraint did more than commentary ever could. Later that day, my phone rang repeatedly. Ruth called with urgency at first, then confusion, then anger. I didn't answer. When messages followed, I didn't respond. There was nothing left to reframe or soften. Distance wasn't punishment. It was clarity implemented too late to feel gentle. In the weeks that followed, the organization stabilized in ways that confirmed the necessity of sequence. Meetings slowed just enough to notice interruption. Participation widened without prompting. People spoke again without scanning the room for alignment. Structure restored balance by doing exactly what it was designed to do once familiarity stopped bending it. At home, silence replaced conversation, and I accepted it without attempting repair. Ending something doesn't always involve confrontation or closure. Sometimes it looks like refusing to renegotiate boundaries once they've finally been named. I didn't describe the outcome as revenge or justice or resolution because it wasn't any of those. It was consistency enforced after too long of accommodation. Choosing distance wasn't an emotional reaction. It was the last necessary step in separating systems built on process from relationships built on imbalance. What ended wasn't just a job or a dynamic. It was the expectation that integrity should be flexible when convenience asks for it. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.